She was 31 years old, wearing scrubs, and nobody in that room thought she was worth listening to. Admiral Victor Kane had 200 of the nation's sharpest military minds at his disposal. Satellite feeds, encrypted terminals, 30 years of command experience. And the country's entire missile defense network was dying, sector by sector, like lights going out across a city before a storm. Emily Carter looked at the screen once. Just once. "You're solving the wrong problem," she said quietly. Kane didn't even turn around. 48 seconds later, the eastern grid went dark. If this story pulls you in, stay until the end. Because what happens next changes everything. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Emily Carter was halfway through a 12-hour shift at Hargrove Memorial when her pager went off. Not the hospital system, not a patient alert, but the secondary device she still carried out of habit, the one she kept meaning to leave in a drawer somewhere and never did. She pulled it from her scrub pocket, glanced at the number on the screen, and stood very still for a moment beside the nurse's station. The message was 4 digits, a grid coordinate prefix she hadn't seen in 6 years. "Carter!" The voice on the phone was clipped, familiar in the way that old commands were familiar. "We've got a situation. Civilian technical volunteer request, authorized at the joint level. You're being asked." "Asked," she repeated. "You know what that means?" She did. It meant it wasn't an order. It also meant it was bad enough that they were calling a 31-year-old ER nurse at 2 in the morning instead of pulling from their own bench. She told the charge nurse she had a family emergency. Her supervisor, Deb, gave her a look that said she didn't entirely believe it, and Emily didn't have time to make the lie better. She grabbed her jacket from the locker room hook, still damp from the rain she'd walked through 6 hours earlier, and went out through the ambulance bay into the cold. The SUV was already waiting. The drive took 40 minutes and involved 2 checkpoints she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. The second guard who waved them through couldn't have been older than 22, and he looked pale in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Emily watched him in the side mirror as they pulled away. Whatever was happening, the people inside already knew it was serious. The facility was built into a hillside east of the city. She wasn't told which city, not officially, though she'd been in Delverton long enough to recognize the ridge line. Underground parking, concrete corridors that hummed with the sound of generators running at capacity. She was given a visitor badge that identified her as E. Carter/civilian/technical consult and nothing else. The man who met her at the elevator was a colonel named Pressfield, 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of tired that came from about 18 consecutive hours in a room with bad news. "Thank you for coming," he said. "What's the problem?" He looked at her for a second, like he was deciding how much to give her up front. "Command network is experiencing a coordinated breach. We've had analysts on it for 6 hours. The intrusion pattern doesn't match anything in our signature database." "How long has the defense grid been degrading?" He stopped walking. "We didn't say it was degrading." "You didn't have to." She kept moving. "You called me. That tells me what your people can't fix." Pressfield caught up with her and didn't say anything else until they reached the command level. The room was bigger than she expected and louder than it should have been. Screens covered 3 walls, satellite feeds, network topology maps, communication traffic, and rolling columns of data. There were maybe 40 people visible from the entrance, and probably more behind the partition at the far end. Analysts at standing terminals, officers in clusters near the main display. The air smelled like burned coffee and something else, something metallic and sharp that came from too many bodies under too much pressure in a recycled air room. At the center of it, in front of the primary display, stood Admiral Victor Kane. She recognized him from press briefings she'd half-watched while eating lunch in the break room at Hargrove. Late 50s, straight-backed, the kind of posture that was either natural or the result of decades making sure nobody ever caught him looking uncertain. He had 3 stars on his collar and the expression of a man who had decided 3 hours ago that he was the smartest person in the building and hadn't updated that assessment since. He was looking at a traffic analysis overlay. Someone at his elbow was talking fast. He wasn't really listening. Emily moved toward the main display and started reading. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask permission. She found an open terminal near the left wall, pulled up the raw signal logs, and began going through them line by line. The data was dense, formatted in a military communication syntax that most of the people in this room had probably studied in theory but never used in an active deployment context. She had, for 3 years. The pattern took her about 4 minutes to see. It was embedded in what looked like transmission noise, the kind of static that network monitors were trained to filter out automatically. Except this static wasn't random. The intervals were too precise, the frequency signatures too consistent. Someone had hidden a message inside the background noise of their own system, and they'd done it using a layering technique that predated every current encryption protocol in use. A technique developed for field use in environments where standard comms were compromised. She knew because she'd helped field test an early version of it. "Excuse me." A young analyst, maybe 25, appeared at her shoulder. "Ma'am, that terminal is restricted access. I'm going to need to see your clearance documentation." "Get Colonel Pressfield," she said without looking up. "Ma'am, get Colonel Pressfield and tell him Carter has an ID on the intrusion pattern." A pause. Then she heard him move away. She kept reading. It took Pressfield 3 minutes to appear, and he had 2 people behind him when he arrived. One of them was a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as NSA Liaison Doran. The other was a uniformed captain who looked like he hadn't slept in a day and a half. "You have something?" Pressfield said. "It's not a breach," Emily said. "It's a message. Somebody is pushing data through your background signal layer using a modified version of a battlefield medical encryption system, the kind used to transmit casualty reports in low-comm environments." Doran moved in beside her. That system was decommissioned. Modified. They updated the interval algorithm. Emily pulled up the pattern she'd isolated. "See these gaps? That's not noise. That's a key. If you're looking for malware, you're never going to find it because there's no malware. It's a data transmission disguised as degraded signal traffic." Doran looked at the screen, then looked at Emily. "How do you know what a battlefield medical encryption signature looks like?" "Because I used it." Silence. Then Doran and Pressfield exchanged a glance she recognized. The fast, private calculation of people reassessing who they were talking to. Before either of them could respond, the room shifted. "What is going on over here?" Admiral Kane didn't phrase it as a question. He moved through the space with the specific energy of a man accustomed to the room reorganizing itself around him. And it did. Analysts stepped back. The captain straightened. Doran turned. Emily didn't move. "Admiral," Pressfield began, "this is the civilian technical consultant I mentioned. I know who she is." Kane looked at Emily with the flat attention of someone cataloging an inconvenience. "You're the nurse." "I am," she said, "and you've been using my systems without authorization. I've been looking at your signal logs. With Colonel Pressfield's, Pressfield doesn't have the authority to grant terminal access at this level." Kane turned to the captain. "Get her a visitor's chair near the back and make sure someone is watching what she's doing with her phone." Emily didn't move. "I've identified the intrusion pattern." Kane looked back at her. "It's not a cyber breach. It's a layered signal transmission using a decommissioned military medical encryption protocol. The data is being pushed through your background traffic. Your analysts have been looking for malware that doesn't exist." The room was quieter now. Several people had stopped what they were doing. Kane looked at the display. Then at her. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small, controlled recalibration. "We have 200 analysts in this facility." "I know." "We have NSA cryptographers, 3 former SIGINT chiefs, and a direct feed from Cybercom." "I know." "And you're suggesting that a visiting nurse identified something in 4 minutes that 6 hours of analysis missed?" Emily held his gaze. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you what I found." Kane was quiet for about 2 seconds. Then he turned to Pressfield. "Get her out of the operational area, now, and tighten the authentication protocols on the secondary terminals. Clearly we have a gap somewhere." She walked. That was the thing nobody watching would have expected. She didn't argue. She didn't try to grab someone's sleeve on the way out or escalate to Doran or make a scene. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where she'd draped it, nodded at Pressfield, who who looked like he was trying to apologize with just his face, and walked toward the corridor. Behind her, she heard someone mutter something about liability and civilians in secured facilities. She heard Kane's voice resume, confident and commanding, directing his analysts back to the malware search. She stopped in the corridor outside the secondary authentication checkpoint. There was a small observation window at shoulder height, reinforced glass, and through it she could see the edge of the main display. The network map, the sectors of the missile defense grid, color-coded by status. She watched a green sector turn yellow, then another. She pulled out the secondary pager she'd brought in with her. Still in her possession, nobody had thought to take it because she was a nurse in scrubs, and nurses in scrubs didn't carry classified gear. She typed in a 4-digit response code and waited. 30 seconds later, her phone rang. Not the pager, her actual phone. Carter. The voice was different this time, older. She placed it immediately. General Morse, she said. I heard you got walked out. About 3 minutes ago. You have an ID. Yes, modified BMEC protocol, variant 3 or later. Someone pushed data through the background layer of the communication satellite feeds. They've been doing it for at least 4 hours. The pattern degrades the farther back you go, which means the transmission is still active. What's in the transmission? I don't know yet. I was removed before I could complete the decode. A pause. Can you complete it from where you are? She looked down the corridor. Depends on whether anyone in that room listens to me in the next 20 minutes. What happens in 20 minutes? She looked through the observation glass again. The yellow sector was still yellow. Below it, a new indicator was pulsing. Not a status change, a communication failure marker. One of the satellite relay nodes had gone unresponsive. The eastern relay goes down, she said. When it does, the backup routing switches to the secondary grid. The secondary grid is where they've been pushing the transmission. Once the backup load is running through it, they trigger phase 2. Another pause. Longer this time. Carter, General Morse said, I'm going to make a call. Make it fast. She hung up and stayed where she was. Through the glass, she could see the analysts moving, the screens updating, Kane at the center of it all with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He looked like a man in control. He looked like a man who was absolutely certain that the problem being worked on was the right problem. The relay node marker pulsed twice, went dark. Then a notification pushed across the main display, large enough that she could read it through the glass even from the corridor. Eastern Relay Node 7, unresponsive. The room reacted. Kane reacted. She saw him point at something, watched the analysts converge on a new section of the display, saw Doran moving fast toward the satellite comm panel. Emily checked the time. 19 minutes since she'd been removed. She was still standing at the observation window when the door at the end of the corridor opened and 3 people came through it. She recognized 2 of them, junior security staff who'd been stationed near the entrance when she arrived. The third was a civilian in a charcoal jacket with no badge visible, which meant either he'd cleared the outer checkpoint on credentials that weren't standard issue, or he'd come in through a different entrance entirely. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who already knew who she was. Ms. Carter, he said. Not a question. Yes. My name is Hawkins, D-I-A. He held up a credentials case, briefly, professionally. I understand you've been asked to leave the operational area. I have. General Morse has requested that you be readmitted under revised authorization. He paused. Admiral Kane has been informed. How did he take it? Hawkins looked at her steadily. He's been informed, he said again. She understood what that meant. It meant Kane knew, and Kane objected, and the authorization was happening anyway, which meant someone above Kane had signed off, which meant this had moved to a level where Kane's objection was logged and noted and carried approximately 0 weight. She picked up her jacket. Let's go, she said. The room had changed temperature, not literally. The recycled air was still the same 68 degrees it had been before. But the atmosphere was different in the way that rooms got different when something had happened and nobody was quite sure what to do with it yet. Kane was at the far end. He looked at her when she walked back in with Hawkins and the security staff. His expression was controlled, but his jaw was tight, and there was something in his eyes she recognized from previous life, the look of a man who'd been overruled and was actively deciding how to respond to it. He didn't say anything. Doran guided her back to a primary terminal. Eastern relay is down. Backup routing is switching now. That's what I expected, Emily said. Don't try to block the reroute. Let it go through. Doran stopped. If the secondary grid is compromised, it's not compromised. It's carrying the transmission. There's a difference. If you block the reroute, you cut off the signal before I can decode the destination. We need to know where it's going. She was already pulling up the secondary grid traffic logs. If you block it, we lose the thread. Doran looked at Hawkins. Hawkins looked at Kane. Kane said nothing. Doran nodded. Let the reroute proceed, she said to the room. Emily sat down and started working. The transmission was longer than she'd initially estimated. The 4-hour visible window was the tail end of something that had been running considerably longer. The layering was more sophisticated than the version she'd used in deployment, which meant either significant resource investment or inside knowledge of the original architecture. Probably both. The data wasn't malware. It wasn't a hack in the traditional sense. It was instructions. Formatted in the same casualty report structure she'd decoded hundreds of times in the field: patient ID, location grid, status code, treatment priority. But these weren't patients. The ID numbers corresponded to something else. And the location grids weren't terrain coordinates. They were target designations. She worked through it quietly, pulling the decode layer by layer, using tools she hadn't touched in 6 years, but that came back to her hands with the specific muscle memory of something learned under pressure. Around her, the room continued its other work. Analysts at their stations, officers in low conversation, the main display cycling through its alerts and status updates. A young analyst appeared at her left shoulder, not to challenge her this time, just watching. Is that really BMEC? He asked quietly. Modified. But yes. I've never seen it used in an actual transmission. Most people haven't, she said. It was mostly theoretical by the time I used it. Where'd you use it? She paused. Overseas. He took the hint and didn't ask more. 40 minutes into the decode, she hit a file partition she hadn't expected. Nested inside the transmission, wrapped in a secondary encryption layer, was a secondary data packet. Smaller, cleaner, different origin signature. Not from outside, from inside. She stared at it. The origin signature pointed to a terminal inside this facility. She traced the access point, a command-level terminal on the eastern wall, restricted access, logged to a specific authorization credential. She knew whose credential it was before she pulled the access log. She pulled it anyway. At the top of the access log, the credential identifier matched the badge number of the senior officer in the room. Emily sat back, just for a second, just to breathe. Then she pulled up everything she needed, captured it cleanly, and turned in her chair. Across the room, Admiral Victor Kane was standing in front of the main display with his arms crossed, watching the satellite feed updates, looking like a man who was confident the situation was being managed. She understood now why he'd been so certain the analysts were looking in the right place. They were looking exactly where he'd pointed them. Emily turned back to the terminal and saved the full decode package. Her hands were steady. She'd learned that in the field, too. How to be steady when the thing you'd found was the thing that changed the shape of everything. Outside, above the bunker, the first drone contact alert appeared at the edge of the northern radar sweep. Small, fast, headed toward restricted airspace. The room hadn't caught it yet. Emily looked at the alert, looked at the decode, looked at Kane. She pressed send on the package. Full decode, origin data, access log, to Hawkins' secure tablet, to Pressfield, to General Morse's direct line. Then she stood up. Admiral Kane, she said. He turned. The room turned with him. The eastern radar sweep just picked up a drone contact entering restricted airspace at the northern boundary. She kept her voice level. It's not the primary threat. It's a diversion. The actual target is the backup communication relay at grid 779er. She paused. And the instructions for the timing were sent from a command terminal in this room 46 minutes ago. The silence that followed was the kind that felt physical. Kane's expression didn't break. Not immediately, not visibly. But she watched something behind his eyes make a very fast, very cold calculation. He opened his mouth. Hawkins' tablet chimed. Hawkins looked at it. Then he looked at Kane. And the look he gave Kane was quiet and specific and completely without ambiguity. Kane closed his mouth. The drone alert escalated on the main display. Red. Incoming. Restricted airspace breach confirmed. And in the corridor outside the command level, Emily heard the sound of boots, not the casual movement of security personnel going about their routine, but the specific, deliberate cadence of people moving with purpose toward a fixed point. She recognized that sound. She'd heard it before, at the end of things. The boots belonged to 6 people. Emily counted them by sound before the door opened. The flat, deliberate rhythm of military investigators, not security staff. Security moved in pairs, and they moved loose. These people moved in formation, which meant they'd been briefed, which meant the package she'd sent had landed somewhere it mattered, and someone with actual authority had made a phone call in the last 4 minutes. Fast. Faster than she expected. The door opened, and a woman came through first. Late 40s, sharp-faced, wearing a DIA field identification on a lanyard over a dark jacket. Behind her came 4 agents in tactical vests and 1 more in civilian clothes who hung back near the entrance with a tablet and a recording device. The woman looked at the room, then at Kane, then at Emily. Special Agent Voss, Defense Intelligence, she said, to the room in general and to Kane in specific. Admiral Kane, I'm going to need you to step away from the primary terminal and remain in the room until further notice. Kane didn't move. On whose authority? Joint Chief, sir, forwarded from the Deputy Secretary of Defense's office. Voss didn't blink. The notification was sent to your communications officer approximately 6 minutes ago. If you'd like to verify, I don't need to verify anything. Kane's voice was the kind of steady that was holding something very careful underneath it. What I need is an explanation for why a DIA field team has entered an active command operation without prior... Admiral. Voss said it the way you said stop to someone who was about to walk into traffic. Not rude, not loud, just a word that meant no further. Step away from the terminal, please. The room was absolutely still. Emily had been in operating rooms when someone called a code. The way all the incidental motion just stopped. Every background process suspended. This was the same quality of silence, except nobody was rushing to save anything. They were all just watching to see what happened next. Kane stepped away from the terminal. He did it slowly with his chin up and his posture intact, like a man choosing to cooperate rather than being required to. But he stepped away. Voss crossed the room to Hawkins. They exchanged something brief and quiet. Hawkins passed her the tablet. She looked at the decode package Emily had sent, scrolled through it for about 30 seconds, then looked up at Emily. You put this together? Yes. In the last, she checked the timestamp, 48 minutes. The identification took about 4 minutes. The full decode took longer. Voss looked at the data again. Walk me through the origin packet. Emily did. She stood beside Voss at the terminal and went through it layer by layer. The transmission structure, the BMEC variant, the nested secondary packet, the internal origin signature, and the access log that tied it to a specific command credential. She kept it factual and sequential. She'd briefed intelligence officers before, and the thing they needed most was exactly what happened and in what order. Not interpretation, not emphasis, just the chain. Voss listened without interrupting. One of her agents was recording. The civilian with the tablet was taking notes. When Emily finished, Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The access log, is it possible it was spoofed from an external source? The signature is internal. External spoofing at this facility would require inside knowledge of the terminal authentication architecture, which is not public information. Which is not public information, Emily agreed. Voss looked at the log one more time. Then she walked back toward Kane. He watched her come. Whatever calculation he'd been running behind his eyes, he had it finished by the time she reached him, because he looked composed. Ready. The expression of a man who had a response prepared. The access log from Terminal 7, Voss said, Shows credential activity under your authorization at 22:14. That's 46 minutes before Ms. Carter flagged the drone contact. She paused. Can you tell me what you were doing at that terminal at 22:14? I can tell you that accessing a command terminal during an active operational crisis is standard practice and not in any way unusual, Kane said. The terminal in question is designated for satellite routing, not command operations. I was reviewing satellite status. For 37 minutes. I review things thoroughly. Voss looked at him for a long moment. She had the patience of someone who'd done this many times and understood that the first few exchanges were rarely where the useful information lived. Admiral Kane, I'd like to continue this conversation in a separate room. My team will maintain operational continuity in here. I'm not going anywhere during an active... Sir. Voss's voice carried the same weight as before. Not aggressive, not deferential, just immovable. The drone contact your analysts are currently tracking is being managed by Northcom through a separate command channel. This facility's role in the active response has been temporarily transferred. She glanced at Pressfield. Colonel, can you confirm? Pressfield looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. He confirmed. Kane's jaw tightened once, then he walked with Voss toward the side corridor. Emily watched them go. Then she turned back to the terminal and kept working. There was still an active threat. Everyone in the room seemed to need a few minutes to remember that, because the Kane situation had pulled all the air toward it. But the drone contact on the northern sweep was real, and it was moving, and the decode she'd pulled had told her more than she'd had time to fully explain to Voss. The drone wasn't the attack. She'd said that, but she'd also said it was a diversion, and what she hadn't said yet, hadn't had the chance to, was that the timing sequence in the transmission suggested the diversion and the primary strike were connected. Not sequential. Simultaneous. The drone would pull radar attention north. The primary target was south. She flagged Pressfield. I need the southern perimeter sensor feed, she said. He came over, looked at what she was working on. What are you seeing? The transmission included a timing sequence. 2 events, 6 minutes apart. The drone contact was Event 1. I don't know what Event 2 is yet, but it's coming from a southern vector. She pulled up the grid. Here, this relay cluster. Pressfield looked at the grid. His face changed. That cluster feeds the secondary defense network. I know. If that cluster goes down, I know what happens if it goes down. She was already building the filter. I need the feed. And I need someone who has authority over the southern perimeter response to be standing here in the next 3 minutes. Pressfield turned and started moving. She heard him behind her, fast and low, talking to someone on a headset. She kept building the filter, pulling the sensor feed up piece by piece, assembling the picture. The young analyst from before appeared at her left shoulder again. She'd noticed he'd been hovering within range since she came back in, close enough to watch, far enough to stay out of the way. What do you need? He said. She looked at him. You know the southern perimeter sensor architecture? I wrote the monitoring protocol for it. Then sit down. He sat. His name tag said Ruiz. He moved fast and didn't ask redundant questions, which immediately made him more useful than half the people in the room. She walked him through what she was looking for, and he found it in about 90 seconds. A pattern of micro disruptions in the southern sensor feed, too small to trigger alerts, too regular to be noise. Someone's been masking them, Ruiz said, staring at his screen. For how long? He scrolled back through the logs. At least 8 hours. 8 hours. Before the drone contact, before the relay failure, before any of the night's events had surfaced, which meant the southern sensor disruptions were the first piece laid down, the foundation the rest of it was built on. They turned your eyes off before they did anything else, Emily said. Ruiz looked at her. How do we turn them back on? You can't, not fast enough. She looked at the grid. You have to send someone there physically. Eyes on the relay cluster now, before the 6-minute window closes. Pressfield had come back with a colonel named Hartwick, Southern Perimeter Command, who had the specific expression of a man who'd been pulled out of another urgent situation to handle this one. Emily didn't waste time on pleasantries. She showed him the sensor disruption pattern, showed him the timing sequence from the transmission, pointed to the grid. I need a team at this relay cluster, she said. Hartwick looked at the grid. That's a restricted infrastructure site. I can't dispatch a response team to a restricted site on the basis of Colonel. She kept her voice flat. Event 1 was the drone contact. The timing sequence says Event 2 follows Event 1 by 6 minutes. We are currently at minute 4. She pointed at the clock on the wall. Dispatch the team. Hartwick looked at Pressfield. Pressfield said, Do it. Oh. The team reached the relay cluster at minute 7, which was 1 minute late, but it turned out the timing sequence had been designed with buffer. Whoever built it had allowed for variance in emergency response times, which said something about how carefully this whole thing had been planned. The team found 3 devices attached to the exterior junction housing of the primary relay transmitter. Not explosive, disruption hardware, designed to sever the transmission pathway and trigger a cascading failure through the secondary defense network. Military grade. The kind of thing that didn't walk through a security checkpoint. It was already on the inside. Emily heard the field report come through the command channel and let out a breath she'd been holding for about 10 minutes. They got it in time, Ruiz said. They got it in time. He sat back in his chair. He looked like he needed a moment and didn't take one. How did you know what to look for? The transmission was formatted as casualty reports, she said. I know what a real one looks like. I know what they look like when the data is wrong. He looked at her. Where were you? Before the hospital. She was quiet for a beat. Somewhere that needed a medic. He nodded. Didn't push it. She appreciated that about him. Across the room, the main display was cycling through alerts, the drone contact was being tracked and intercepted, and the relay cluster was secure. The immediate crisis was contained. The room felt it. The specific quality of collective exhale that followed a situation stepping back from the edge. But Emily wasn't exhaling, because the decode package she'd sent to Voss had more in it than the origin log. There were communication fragments embedded in the transmission, the kind that accumulated when someone used the same access channel repeatedly over time, not just tonight. The fragments were dated. Some of them went back 14 months. This hadn't been improvised. She'd included it all in the package, but she hadn't had time to explain the timeline, and she wasn't sure Voss had processed the dates yet. And that mattered because it changed the scale of what they were looking at. This wasn't a crisis with a corrupt officer in the middle of it. This was a corrupt officer who had been in the middle of things for over a year. She needed to talk to Voss. She found one of Voss's agents near the partition and told him. He made a call. 5 minutes later, she was in the corridor outside the side room where Voss was still with Kane. She waited. The corridor was quieter out here. There was a water fountain that made a faint mechanical hum and a light panel overhead that flickered every 40 seconds or so, the kind of small building malfunction that nobody had gotten around to fixing. She stood under the flickering light and thought about the fragments in the transmission and what they meant. 14 months of access. 14 months of someone inside this facility using a classified terminal to push data through a channel that nobody was monitoring because nobody was supposed to know the channel existed. That was a long time to be invisible. That was a long time to be underestimated. She almost laughed at that. Almost. Voss came out 20 minutes later. She closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor, and she looked like someone who had just heard something that had not made her job easier. He's asking for counsel, Voss said. He'll get it. He's also claiming the access log is fabricated. I expected that. Voss looked at her steadily. He's specifically claiming that someone with technical expertise and access to the facility's systems planted the log to implicate him. Emily waited. He named you, Voss said. She was quiet for a second. I was removed from the operational area before the log entry I flagged. The timeline doesn't support that. I know the timeline. Then you know the claim doesn't hold. I do. Voss paused. But it's going to be raised, formally, which means your background is going to be part of the record. If there's anything in your service history that could complicate, run my file. Voss looked at her. Run my file, Emily said again. Whatever's in it, it's there. I'm not going to brief you on it selectively, and I'm not going to ask you to skip anything. She held Voss's gaze. But while you're running it, look at the transmission date fragments I included in the package. The timestamps go back 14 months. That's the scope of what you're actually dealing with. Voss had a way of being still when she was processing something. Not blank, exactly, but contained. She was still now. I saw the dates, Voss said quietly. Then you know this isn't about tonight. No. Voss looked down the corridor toward the door. It's really not. Yeah. General Morse arrived at 4:40 in the morning. Emily heard the change in the room before she saw him. That subtle reorganization of posture and attention that happened when someone walked in who carried genuine weight. Not performed authority, not institutional rank, actual weight. The kind that came from a long career of being right in situations where being wrong had real consequences. He was in his early 60s, medium height, wearing a field uniform that looked like he'd put it on in a car. He scanned the room as he entered, found Pressfield, found Hawkins, found Voss's agents, and then he found Emily. He walked directly to her. "Carter," he said. "General? You look exactly the same." "I really don't, sir." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. He looked at the terminal she'd been working on, looked at the display. "Full decode?" "Sent to Voss 40 minutes ago. Southern perimeter was secured at minute 7. The drone is down." She paused. "There's a 14-month timeline in the fragments." Morse nodded once, slowly, like he'd been half expecting it, and was allowing himself the confirmation. "Kane knows you're the one who pulled it. He knows. He's claiming fabrication." "Voss told me." Morse looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had spent decades in situations that required quick and accurate reads of people, and she could feel that read happening even now, even though he'd known her before, even though her file said what it said. "Your service record is still classified," he said. "What I can access, what Voss can access through standard channels, it won't tell the full story." "I know. Kane's team is going to use that gap." "I know that too." "So tell me what you want to do," Morse said, not rhetorically. An actual question. She looked at the display. The relay cluster was holding. The drone intercept was confirmed. The transmission was decoded and packaged, and in the hands of people with authority. The immediate crisis was over. What remained was the institutional one. "I want the record complete," she said, "whatever that takes." Morse was quiet for a moment. "That's going to mean declassifying parts of your file." "I understand. Some of those parts were classified to protect you." She met his gaze. "I know why they were classified, sir. I was there." She paused. "But if leaving them classified gives Kane's attorneys something to point at, then the protection doesn't work anymore." Morse looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll make the calls." It took 2 hours. 2 hours during which Emily sat at a terminal that was now hers by uncontested right. Nobody asked her credentials. Nobody suggested she step back. Nobody came to tell her she was in a restricted area. Ruiz stayed at the next station, and they worked through the remaining fragments in the transmission together, building the complete timeline piece by piece. What emerged was not just evidence of tonight's operation. It was a pattern. 14 months of small manipulations, supply chain data routed through unauthorized channels, maintenance schedules for critical infrastructure, appearing in transmission fragments that should have contained nothing but noise, personnel deployment data pushed through a system that wasn't supposed to be carrying it. Any single piece looked like an anomaly. Together they told a coherent story. Kane had been feeding operational information through the modified BMEC channel for over a year. Whether for personal financial benefit, for leverage, for some arrangement Emily couldn't fully see yet, that was Voss's work, not hers. Her work was the decode, and the decode was complete. She saved the final compiled package at 6:23 in the morning. Outside, she could tell it was getting light, though there were no windows. She knew from the quality of the silence, the way sounds from above ground changed after dawn, something about the way the building settled, something she'd noticed in other facilities like this one. Ruiz looked at his screen. "That's everything?" "Everything that was recoverable." She stretched her neck, which was aching from 6 hours of hunching over a terminal. "You've got enough to trace the source network. That's a different team's job." "Right." He rubbed his eyes. He was probably in his mid-20s, and he looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for too long. "For what it's worth, I've been working signals analysis for 3 years. I've never seen anyone pull a decode that fast. She looked at him. You found the sensor disruption pattern in 90 seconds. That's different. Not really. She closed the terminal. Get some sleep when this is over. He looked slightly surprised, like the suggestion hadn't occurred to him. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. She stood up and her back protested in about 4 places simultaneously. She ignored it. Across the room, Voss had returned and was conferring with 2 of her agents near the partition. Hawkins was on a phone call near the eastern wall. The room had thinned out. Some of the junior analysts cycled off, replaced by a fresh rotation, but the density of the crisis hour was gone. She looked for Morse and found him near the entrance, talking to a tall man in a suit she didn't recognize. Morse caught her eye and gestured her over. Carter, this is Assistant Deputy Director Galloway, NSA. Morse said it like a neutral introduction, but she caught the edge underneath it. Pay attention to this person. Galloway looked at her the way powerful people sometimes looked at surprising things, carefully, like they were trying to decide if the surprise was worth keeping. Ms. Carter, he said, your work tonight has been significant. She waited. I've been briefed on your service record, Galloway said. The parts that have been made available in the last 2 hours. He paused. I have to tell you, the gap between what I assumed I was dealing with when I heard civilian nurse volunteer and what your actual background indicates is considerable. I'm still a nurse, she said. That part wasn't a cover. No, he said. I understand that. He looked at Morse briefly, then back at her. We're going to need a formal statement, on the record, about the decode process, the origin identification, the timeline reconstruction. I understand. That statement will become part of the case file. He paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality. Kane's legal team will have access to it under discovery. I know. Are you prepared for... I've been prepared for it since about 2:30 this morning, Emily said. When I was walked out of this room the first time. Galloway looked at her steadily for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but recalibrated, like he was adjusting for accuracy. All right, he said. The formal statement took another 90 minutes. Voss conducted it, with a recording system and a stenographer and one of Galloway's people sitting in, and Emily went through everything in sequence: the call, the drive, the signal identification, the removal, the conversation with Morse, the readmission, the full decode process, and the 14-month timeline. She answered clarifying questions without elaboration and didn't editorialize. Voss was professional and precise and gave nothing away about what she thought of any of it. When it was over, Emily asked for a glass of water. Someone brought her one. She sat for a moment in the now quiet room, just holding the glass and not drinking it. One more thing, Voss said from across the table. In your statement, you described the origin packet as tied to a specific command credential. She looked at her notes. But you said you knew whose credential it was before you pulled the access log. Emily looked at her. How? Voss asked. It was a good question. A real one, but not a trap, not a setup. Voss actually wanted to know. The secondary packet was cleaner than the primary transmission, Emily said. Technically cleaner, better encryption discipline, someone who understood the system better than the people who built the primary transmission did. And that told you it was Kane. It told me it was someone with deep internal knowledge of the facility's architecture. She paused. Combined with the fact that he immediately recognized my assessment of the transmission pattern and immediately moved to discredit it before he'd even reviewed what I was looking at. She set down the glass. People who are wrong in good faith want to understand your reasoning. People who are wrong because they know you're right want you out of the room. Voss was quiet for a moment. He wanted you out fast, she said. Very fast. Voss made a note. Looked at it, looked up. You said during the incident that Kane didn't understand the problem. You said he was solving the wrong problem. That's what I said. Did you know then that he was doing it deliberately? Emily considered that. I thought it was possible. I didn't have evidence yet. She paused. But the way he moved to remove me, the way he didn't engage with what I'd found, it had a quality to it. Urgency without curiosity. That's not how good faith confusion looks. Voss nodded slowly. She closed her folder. We're done for now. She looked at Emily across the table with an expression that was direct and clear, and didn't carry the particular weight of someone who was trying to make you feel either better or worse than warranted. Thank you for the record. Yeah, Emily said. She was in the corridor outside the statement room, jacket on, visitor badge in her hand, when she heard the sound from inside the command level. Not voices, not an alert, the specific heavy clatter of a door being opened and held, and then footsteps she didn't recognize. She turned. Through the command level entrance, she could see across the main floor to the far corridor. Kane was coming out of the side room with Voss on one side and 2 agents on the other. He was walking under his own authority, head up, nothing visibly restraining him, but the configuration of bodies was not ambiguous. He wasn't being walked somewhere of his own choice. He saw her. The distance between them was maybe 40 feet across a room full of people and equipment and the residue of a long night. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she saw in his face something she recognized. Not guilt, not exactly. More like the specific outrage of a person who had been very sure they understood all the variables and had discovered too late that they hadn't accounted for one of them. The one standing in scrubs with a visitor badge and 6 years of something nobody in this room had been able to see. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. Voss moved them toward the exit corridor, and they were gone from her sightline. Emily looked down at the visitor badge in her hand. E. Carter/civilian/technical consult. She turned it over. On the back, someone had written in pen. She didn't know when, didn't know who. A secondary clearance notation that hadn't been there when she arrived. She looked at it for a moment. Then from the command level, she heard someone say her name, loud enough to carry. Not calling for her, talking about her. She heard enough of it to understand what was being said, and what was being said was that the investigation team had just found something in the 14-month transmission archive that she hadn't identified yet. Something beyond the operational data, beyond the deployment information, and the infrastructure schedules. Something that had names in it. Not her name, other names. Officers. Officials. People beyond Kane. The door swung open and Hawkins appeared in the corridor, moving fast, his expression stripped of its earlier professionalism, carrying the specific look of someone who'd just discovered a small problem was significantly larger than estimated. "Carter," he said, "we need you back in there." She put the visitor badge in her jacket pocket. "What did you find?" she said. "The transmission fragments." He was already moving back toward the door. "There are 12 additional identifiers we can't cross-reference with any internal database. We think they're external contacts, but the encoding is the same variant." He stopped, looked at her. "You already knew there was more." "I suspected," she said. "I didn't have time to finish the secondary analysis before the statement." "Can you finish it now?" She thought about Hargrove Memorial, about Deb's look when she'd said family emergency, about her locker room jacket, still faintly damp, about the patient she'd been treating when the pager went off. A 72-year-old with a possible cardiac event who she'd handed to the on-call without a proper handoff briefing, which she'd been thinking about on and off since 3 a.m. She thought about the 12 additional identifiers embedded in a classified transmission that had been running for 14 months inside a facility that was supposed to be one of the most secure in the country. "Yes," she said. She followed Hawkins back through the door. Behind her in the corridor, her phone buzzed. She didn't take it out. She already knew it was probably Deb. She'd deal with Deb later. She'd deal with all of it later. Right now, there were 12 names nobody could read, and she was the only person in the building who knew how to look. The 12 identifiers took her 40 minutes to crack, and they were not what anyone in the room was expecting. She worked at the primary terminal with Ruiz beside her and Hawkins standing 2 feet back, close enough to see the screen, far enough to stay out of her way. The identifier encoding was the same BMEC variant as the rest of the transmission, but compressed differently, tighter, with a secondary obfuscation layer that suggested whoever built this part of the package was more technically sophisticated than the people who'd built the outer shell. Different hands, different level of expertise. She said as much to Hawkins. "You think there's a second architect," he said, I think the outer transmission was built by someone who understood the BMEC protocol well enough to use it. This layer was built by someone who understood it well enough to modify the modification. She pulled the compression structure apart line by line. That's a different skill set. Which means Kane may not have built this. He may have been the access point, not the architect. Hawkins was quiet for a moment. Then, that makes it larger. Yes. She kept working. The identifiers resolved one by one. Not names, not immediately, but reference codes that pointed to a secondary registry she didn't have access to. She flagged each one and handed the list to Hawkins, who took it to Voss, who made another call that Emily didn't hear the content of. The room was quieter now. The rotation had changed again, and the people currently on the floor were a tighter group. Fewer analysts, more investigators, the specific composition of a crisis that had transitioned from active response to active inquiry. The 11th identifier resolved to something that made Ruiz stop typing. That's a contractor registry code, he said. She looked at it. Defense contractor? Tier 1. The prefix is DOD acquisition. He looked at the identifier more carefully. I've seen this format before. It's used for entities with classified procurement contracts. She looked at the number. The timestamp on this identifier was different from the others. Older. Not 14 months ago, closer to 2 years. This one's been in the system longer, she said. Ruiz nodded slowly. If it's a contractor with classified procurement access, they'd have infrastructure knowledge. She finished it. They'd know the architecture. She looked at Hawkins. He was already on the phone. The 12th identifier was still processing when Voss came back into the room, and the expression on her face was the kind that meant the phone call had produced information that reordered something significant. Voss came directly to Emily. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the screen, at the 11 resolved identifiers, at the 12th still working. The contractor registry code, she said. Yes. We have a preliminary match. Voss paused. The entity has an active maintenance contract for this facility, has had one for 22 months. Emily let that sit for exactly 1 second. Then she said, they have physical access. Scheduled access for system maintenance. Voss's voice was flat and careful, which would explain how the disruption hardware at the Southern Relay got inside the perimeter. It wouldn't have been brought through a checkpoint. It would have arrived in a maintenance kit, logged through the facility's own access system, handled by a technician with a valid credential and a scheduled appointment, invisible, for 22 months. Where are the maintenance personnel now? Emily said. Voss looked at Hawkins. Hawkins was already moving. The answer was that 2 of the 3 scheduled maintenance technicians for this facility were not where they were supposed to be. The third one, a woman named Paris, who'd been on site for a routine systems check 2 days earlier, was currently sitting in a break room on the facility's administrative level because she'd stayed late due to a documentation backlog and had been locked in when the facility went to restricted status at the start of the crisis. She didn't know what had happened. She'd been sitting in the break room for 7 hours with a cold cup of coffee and a paperback novel, waiting for someone to tell her she could leave. Emily found this out through Hawkins, and she found the next part out through Voss. The other 2 technicians, the ones who weren't where they were supposed to be, had badged out of the facility at 1943 and 1951, respectively. Roughly 2 hours before the first signal's anomaly appeared. Roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes before Emily got the call. They'd been gone before anything started, which meant they'd known what was starting. The 12th identifier finished resolving at 7:14 in the morning. Emily looked at it, then she looked at Ruiz. You recognize that format? He looked at the screen. His expression shifted. That's not a contractor code. No. That's a personnel identifier. Yes. Internal personnel. He looked at her. Someone inside this facility. She nodded. The identifier didn't resolve to a name on its own. It pointed to a classified personnel record that required a higher access level than either of them held. She saved the code and pulled Voss over and showed her. Voss looked at it. Something behind her eyes shifted. A controlled internal reaction, the kind trained people had when they recognized something they'd been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. I need to make a call, Voss said. I know, Emily said. Voss took the code to the far side of the room and made the call. Emily watched her from a distance and tried to read the shape of the conversation from posture alone. Voss stood very still. She said 3 things and then listened for a long time. When she turned back around, she found Emily's gaze across the room and held it for a moment. Then she walked back. The personnel identifier corresponds to a signals intelligence officer assigned to this facility 8 months ago, Voss said. Captain Marcus Webb. Emily didn't know the name. She looked at Hawkins, who shook his head slightly. He didn't know it either. Where's Captain Webb now? She said. That's the issue, Voss said. He reported for duty at 1800 yesterday evening, standard shift check-in, but his last access log entry inside the secure perimeter is at 2130. She paused. 1 hour before the signals anomaly began. Emily did the math. He logged in for his shift, stayed 3.5 hours, and then disappeared, Voss said, from inside a restricted facility with no badged exit on record. The room was very quiet. There's a secondary exit route in facilities like this, Emily said. Maintenance tunnels. Emergency egress. We know. Voss's voice was tight. We're checking them now. Emily looked at the main display, looked at the facility schematic that Ruiz had pulled up on the adjacent screen, the building layout, the tunnel network, the emergency egress points. She looked at the southern relay cluster, looked at its position relative to the tunnel network. The maintenance tunnel nearest the southern relay cluster, she said. Does it connect to the administrative level? Ruiz zoomed in on the schematic, traced the line, stopped. It connects to the break room level, he said. He looked at Emily, mustn't. 1 level above the break room. Emily turned to Voss. Paris? She said. The technician in the break room. Voss was already moving. The break room was on the administrative level, 2 floors up, and it took Emily and Voss 4 minutes to get there with 2 agents. They went fast, not running, the controlled pace of people who didn't want to alert anyone but understood that time had meaning. The hallway outside the break room was quiet. Institutional lighting, beige walls, a fire safety notice that someone had taped slightly crooked. The door at the end of the corridor, which should have led to a storage area, was 1/8 of an inch off its frame. Voss stopped the group 10 feet from the break room door. One agent went past them toward the storage corridor. The other positioned left. Voss looked at Emily once, not a question, just an acknowledgement, and pushed the break room door open. The woman inside was in her 30s, in gray coveralls with the contractor logo on the shoulder, sitting at a table with a paperback face down in front of her and a cold coffee. She looked up when the door opened, and her expression was the confusion of someone who'd been waiting a long time and expected this to be the person finally telling her she was clear to leave. She registered Voss's credentials. She registered the agent in the doorway. And something happened in her face. Not guilt, exactly, but a rapid reassessment that was faster than an innocent person would have needed to make. Miss Paris, Voss said, are you all right? I've been stuck in here since about 9, Paris said. Her voice was careful. Is everything... What's happening? We're resolving a facility incident. We're going to need to ask you a few questions. Sure. She put the paperback down. Of course. Voss moved into the room. Emily stayed near the door and looked at the table. Cold coffee. Paperback. A maintenance tablet, the kind the technicians use to log their work, screen dark. And on the floor beneath the table, half hidden by the chair leg, a second bag. Not the standard contractor field kit. Smaller. Darker. Emily looked at it. Then she looked at Paris. Paris saw her looking. Whatever the calculation was, it happened in about half a second. Paris moved fast, faster than Emily expected from someone who'd been sitting in a chair for 7 hours, reaching for the bag, coming up out of the chair. Voss caught her before she got 2 steps. Not cleanly. Paris was stronger than she looked, and they went sideways into the table, and the coffee cup went over and the paperback hit the floor. The second agent was through the door in 2 seconds, and between them they had Paris against the wall with her hands controlled inside 5 seconds. It was messy and loud and knocked one of the overhead light panels loose. Emily picked up the bag from where it had slid across the floor in the scramble. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside, A secondary communications device with a BMEC transmission signature still active on its screen. A personnel access card with Captain Webb's photograph and a different name. And a folded paper document, printed, not digital, that was either a set of instructions or a set of coordinates or both, in a format she recognized immediately. Modified BMEC. Printed. A physical backup, in case the digital channel was lost. She wasn't locked in here, Emily said. Voss, breathing hard, looked at her from across the room. She was waiting, Emily said, for the all-clear signal on the extraction route. She looked at the active transmission device. For Webb. Webb was found in the maintenance tunnel at 7:51 in the morning. He was not found because anyone saw him move. He was found because Ruiz, still at the primary terminal downstairs, cross-referenced the facility's internal sensor grid, the one Webb himself probably thought he'd disabled, and found a single thermal signature in the tunnel system that the disruptors at the southern relay had missed because the disruption coverage hadn't extended quite far enough north. A 15-meter gap in the sensor blackout. Webb had been sitting in it, waiting, for over 6 hours. The apprehension was handled by the facility's internal security team. It was not clean. Webb went through a junction hatch and one of the security officers went down hard on the tunnel floor and came up with a bad shoulder and a lot of bruised pride. Webb made it approximately 40 more meters before the tunnel dead-ended at a sealed emergency exit that had been remotely locked 20 minutes earlier by Voss, who had thought about exits from the beginning and prepared for this. He was in custody by 8:04. Emily heard about it secondhand from Hawkins, who came back to the command level looking like a man who'd been awake for too long and had too much adrenaline still in his system with nowhere to send it. Webb talked, Hawkins said. He said it like he was still processing it. Already? He started talking before they got him out of the tunnel. Hawkins sat down in a chair that wasn't his and put his hands on his knees. The kind of talking you do when you realize the exit route is gone and the plan is gone and the only card you have left is information. What did he give them? Enough. Hawkins looked at her. Kane wasn't the top. Kane was the access point. Webb was the internal architect. But the contractor entity, the one in the 12th identifier, that's where the operation was being directed from. She'd expected that, hadn't wanted it confirmed because confirmed meant the scale was what she'd feared. Who's running the contractor entity? Hawkins shook his head. Webb claims he doesn't know. Says all his contact was through the transmission channel and all contact was one-directional. He paused. But the printed document Paris was carrying, the physical backup. Voss's team broke the format in about an hour. It's a communications directory. Names, contact protocols, 3 relay points. Emily looked at him. 7 names, Hawkins said quietly. 4 of them hold current government positions. The silence that followed was the kind that came from standing at the edge of something and looking down and realizing the bottom was much farther than you thought. 7 people, she said. 7 confirmed. Webb's testimony and the directory together are enough to open formal proceedings against all of them. Hawkins was quiet for a moment. Voss says it's the largest domestic network penetration case her team has ever worked. Emily looked at the main display across the room. The defense grid was green, all sectors. The relay cluster was secure, the drone was down, the transmission channel was dead. From a tactical standpoint, the night was over. The crisis had been averted in about as close to real time as was operationally possible. From every other standpoint, it was just beginning. Kane's lawyers filed a formal complaint at 6:45 this morning, Hawkins said, challenging your access to the facility's systems, challenging the evidentiary chain on the decode. He paused. They're claiming procedural violations in the way you were readmitted. She looked at him. Is it going to work? Boss doesn't think so. The readmission authorization came from the Joint Chiefs level. Galloway signed off. The chain is solid. He paused. But it means this goes to a formal board. Military tribunal, probably. For Kane. Federal proceedings for the civilian contacts. That's where it belongs. It is. Hawkins looked at her. It also means you're going to be in the middle of it for a while. Depositions. Board appearances. He paused. Your service record is going to be fully in the record. She understood what he was telling her. Not a warning, exactly, More like a door opening and someone showing her what was on the other side of it. 6 years of working in an emergency room in Delverton. 6 years of being the nurse who kept to herself, who sometimes stayed late, who knew too much about trauma without ever explaining where she'd learned it. 6 years of a life that was real and chosen and hers. And now all of it in a formal record, in a proceeding, attached to her name. She thought about whether she minded. She was still thinking about it when General Morse came back into the command level and crossed directly to her. He was carrying something. She saw it when he got close enough. A slim file folder, the kind used for personnel documentation. He held it out to her. She took it. Inside was a single document. She read the header, read the body, read the signature at the bottom. She looked up at Morse. It was already in process, he said, before tonight, but tonight accelerated it. The document in her hands was a formal declassification order for the relevant portions of her military service record. Standard format, joint signatures, effective immediately. Your service is on the record now, Morse said, all of it. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked around the room, at the screens, at the analysts, at Ruiz across the space who caught her gaze and looked away quickly, like he'd been watching and hadn't meant to get caught. At the terminal she'd worked at for the last 6 hours, at the door through which Kane had been walked 2 hours ago. General, she said. Carter. The 7 names in the directory. She held his gaze. How high does this go? Morse looked at her. He was the kind of person whose face gave away very little, and right now it was giving away even less than usual. He looked at the folder in her hands, looked back at her. High enough, he said, that the people who need to know already know, and high enough that the people who don't yet know are about to have a very difficult morning. She thought about that. Then her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out, expecting Deb again, already formulating an apology that covered 7 hours without covering anything she couldn't say. It wasn't Deb. The number on the screen was a government exchange she didn't recognize. She answered it. Ms. Carter. The voice was measured, senior, carrying the specific cadence of someone accustomed to calls that mattered. This is the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I'd like you to come to Washington. She flew to Washington on a government aircraft that seated 8 and was currently carrying 3. Her, a DIA escort named Fielding, who didn't speak unless spoken to, and a woman from Galloway's office named Tran, who spent the entire flight on a secure laptop with her back angled away from the window. Nobody offered Emily breakfast. She didn't ask. She sat in the rear-facing seat and watched the runway disappear below them and tried to remember the last time she'd eaten something. The granola bar from her locker, sometime around 11 the previous evening, before the pager went off. That was it, 15 hours ago. She found a water bottle in the seat pocket and drank half of it and tried to organize what she knew into what she could use, because a call from the Deputy Secretary of Defense at 8:22 in the morning was not an invitation to a conversation. It was an invitation to a specific kind of meeting where specific things were going to be asked, and what you said and how you said it had consequences that extended well past the room. She'd been in meetings like that before. Different rooms, different stakes, different version of herself sitting in the chair, younger, less certain, still learning that the way to survive them was to answer what was asked, volunteer nothing, and trust that the truth was its own architecture if you built it cleanly. Tran looked up from the laptop once. Is there anything you need for the meeting? The full transmission archive, Emily said. Not just what I compiled last night. The original raw logs from the satellite feed from the first anomaly onward. And the access log chronology, time-stamped against Kane's duty schedule for the last 14 months. Tran typed something. I'll have it pulled. And Webb's initial statement, before any formal interview, the tunnel conversation. Tran looked at her. That's not in the standard briefing package. I know. A pause. Tran typed something else. I'll see what I can do. Oops. The meeting was in a building 2 blocks from the Hayward Federal Complex, in a conference room on the 4th floor that had no windows and very good soundproofing and the specific quality of institutional permanence that came from being used for serious things over a long period of time. The table could seat 20. There were 9 people at it when Emily arrived. She recognized Galloway. She recognized a woman in a Navy uniform, 3 stars, name tag that said Whitmore, who she placed as the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Director she'd seen in a press briefing once, probably 2 years ago. She recognized the legal notation on the folders in front of two of the civilians, which meant they were attorneys, which meant this was already at a level of formality that would produce a record. The man at the head of the table stood when she came in. 50s. The build of someone who'd kept up a physical practice for decades without making it an identity. Gray suit, no visible insignia. She'd looked up the deputy secretary's biography on Fielding's tablet during the drive from the airfield. His name was Harlan Dice. "Ms. Carter," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course. Sit wherever you're comfortable." She chose the seat that gave her the clearest sightline to the door and the most people in her direct eye line simultaneously. An old habit. Dice sat. "You've had a long night." "Yes, sir." "We're going to try to make this efficient." He opened the folder in front of him. "You've been briefed that we're pursuing formal proceedings against Admiral Kane, Captain Webb, and the contractor entity associated with the transmission network. The 7 names from the communications directory are in the process of being notified of their status as subjects of a federal inquiry." She waited. "What you haven't been fully briefed on," Dice continued, "is that 2 of those 7 names are currently active in positions that give them access to ongoing classified operations. One of them has been in that position for the duration of the transmission network's operation." He looked at her steadily. "Which means we have a live exposure problem." She understood immediately what that meant. Not a past problem, an ongoing one. Whatever the network had been feeding out over the 14 months was still relevant, because the person feeding it was still in place, still had access, still, until the moment their formal notification arrived, could keep moving. "When does notification go out?" she said. "The order is signed. It hasn't been delivered yet." Dice paused. "We're managing the timing deliberately. Once these individuals know their subjects, information control becomes significantly more complicated. You want to pull what they currently have access to before they know you're coming. We want to understand the full scope of the exposure before we close the loop." Dice looked at her. "Which is where you come in." The attorney to Dice's left opened a second folder. She was in her 40s, efficient-looking, with the expression of someone who'd learned to separate the interesting parts of her job from the disturbing parts and keep them in different compartments. "Ms. Carter, the transmission archive you compiled gives us the outbound data picture. What was sent, when, to whom. What we don't have yet is the inbound picture." Emily looked at her. "What came back?" "Correct. The channel was bidirectional. We know it was used for outbound data exfiltration. We have reason to believe it was also used to push inbound operational instructions to Kane and Webb. If we can decode the inbound layer, you'd know what they were told to do," Emily said, "and when and by whom." "Exactly. The inbound layer would use a different key structure," Emily said. "The BMEC variant that I decoded was built for outbound casualty-style data. For inbound instructions, they'd need something that looked like," she thought about it, "administrative traffic, scheduling, logistics, the kind of thing that moves through command systems constantly and doesn't get flagged." The attorney was writing. "It would be low volume, small packets, embedded in routine administrative traffic from an internal source." She looked at the table. Which terminal was Webb's primary workstation? One of the other people at the table, a younger man, analyst type, pulled something up on his laptop. "Terminal 4, Signals Intelligence Bay." "What's the routine administrative traffic load on that bay's network?" "Hi, it's a signals facility." "Then that's where I'd look." She paused. "I'd also look at the dates in the outbound archive against any anomalous patterns in Webb's terminal usage. If instructions came in before major outbound events, they'd show up as a cluster. Inbound packet, then 2 to 4 days later, outbound data push." The analyst was typing fast. Dice was watching her with the careful attention of someone calibrating something. "How long to identify the inbound layer if it's there?" She thought about it honestly. "Depends on the traffic volume. If the archive goes back 14 months and Webb's terminal was active throughout, 8 hours, maybe 12. A pause around the table. "We'd like you to do that work here," Dice said. "In this building, with full access to the archive and a secure terminal, with legal counsel present and a formal protective protocol around your findings. She understood what the protective protocol meant. It meant her work would be airtight. Chain of custody from the first keystroke. No gap for Kane's attorneys to point at. "I need sleep first," she said. Dice looked at her. "I've been awake for," she checked, "26 hours. If you want clean analysis, I need 4 hours of sleep, non-negotiable." She met his gaze evenly. "The archive has been there for 14 months. It'll be there at noon." A beat of silence. "We have a rest facility in the building," Dice said. "That works." She slept for 4 hours and 17 minutes on a narrow bed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and recycled air. It wasn't good sleep. She surfaced twice, once when a door closed somewhere down the corridor, and once for no reason she could identify, just her nervous system doing its routine check. But it was enough. She'd learned in the field how to extract functional rest from inadequate conditions. She woke up, splashed water on her face in the attached bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She'd been in the same scrubs for 27 hours. Someone had left a clean t-shirt and a pair of slacks in a bag outside the door. Her size, approximately right, which meant someone had looked at her and made a reasonable estimate. She put them on. They fit well enough. She was at a secure terminal by 12:04. The inbound layer was there. She found the first trace of it 40 minutes in, buried in a maintenance scheduling log from 18 months ago, a packet of 7 bytes that didn't belong in a maintenance schedule, formatted in a variant she hadn't seen before, but that was architecturally related to the BMEC modification she'd already decoded. Same underlying logic, different application. It was elegant, actually, in the way that things built by people who genuinely understood their tools were elegant. She didn't admire it out loud. She documented it. She worked through the afternoon with Ruiz, who had apparently been transported to Washington separately at Galloway's request, which meant someone had recognized in the last 12 hours that he was useful and should be kept close. And a signals analyst named Park, who was NSA and had a security clearance that was significantly above Emily's own and still deferred to her on the BMEC architecture because she was the one who'd used it in the field. And there was a difference between knowing a system theoretically and knowing it in your hands. Park was good. He was the kind of analyst who could take a framework she built and run it 3 times faster than she could once he understood the logic. They divided the archive. She'd identify and decode, he'd process and categorize. Ruiz would cross-reference with the outbound timeline. By 3:30 in the afternoon, they had a preliminary map. The inbound instructions covered 11 months. They predated some of the outbound exfiltration, which confirmed the sequence. Instructions came in, Kane and Webb acted on them, data went out. The instructions were formatted as operational directives, specific, sequenced, authored by someone who understood both the target systems and the operational context well enough to give actionable guidance. The instructions referenced things that had happened, maintenance windows that had been extended, personnel deployment decisions that had gone a particular way, access protocols that had been quietly modified. Individually, each change was defensible as a routine operational decision. Together, they'd been creating gaps, systematic, carefully spaced gaps in the facility's security architecture. Not to steal information, not primarily. To create access. For tonight. For the relay cluster attack. For the drone diversion. All of it had been prepared over 11 months of incremental manipulation, each step small enough to not trip an alert, the whole sequence pointing toward a single operational moment. Tonight had been the intended end of a very long setup. They were patient, Ruiz said, looking at the timeline they'd built. Very, Emily said. Why tonight? Why this specific moment? She'd been thinking about that. The defense grid was scheduled for a major software update next week. Standard cycle. After the update, the secondary grid routing we exploited would have been restructured. The vulnerability window closes. She looked at the timeline. If they didn't move this week, they'd have to start over. Park looked up from his terminal. So the whole 14-month operation had a deadline. Yes. And they almost made it. Emily looked at the decoded inbound archive. 11 months of instructions, 11 months of preparation, an operation that had been designed, funded, staffed, and executed with the kind of organizational discipline that required significant resources and significant commitment. Almost, she said. Not. She presented the findings to Dice and the full working group at 5:47 in the evening in the same fourth-floor room. There were more people now. 17 at the table, several more standing at the perimeter. She stood at the head and walked through it. She'd done briefings that were longer, more complicated, more technically dense. But she couldn't remember one where the room was this quiet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked for clarification until she invited it. They just watched and listened, and the quality of the attention in the room was the specific kind that came from people understanding that what they were hearing was going to determine a significant number of decisions that mattered. When she finished, there was a short silence. Then Whitmore, the 3-star Navy admiral, said, "The inbound author. You said the instruction set was authored by someone with deep operational knowledge. Do the inbound packets contain any identifying signature?" "Yes," Emily said. "The same secondary obfuscation architecture as the nested packet from last night. Same hand. Can you identify the hand?" "Not from the architecture alone. The style is consistent with someone trained in military signals intelligence at a senior level. The operational knowledge embedded in the instructions suggests familiarity with this specific facility's security architecture, either from previous access or from detailed briefings." She paused. "The contractor entity is the most direct line. Webb's statement points there. The inbound author is likely either directing the contractor entity or is the contractor entity." Whitmore looked at Dice. Something passed between them. Not a question and answer, more like two people confirming a shared conclusion. "The contractor entity's principal," Dice said to the room, "has been identified as a former NSA senior officer named Roland Veck, retired 4 years ago. Has held 3 defense contractor positions since, with progressively higher classified procurement access." He paused. "Notification of subject status was delivered to Veck's registered address at 4:15 this afternoon." Emily looked at him. "Before we finish the inbound analysis." "Yes." Dice's expression was controlled. "The delivery was part of the coordinated notification sequence. We didn't have your analysis yet when the timing was set." "So he knows." "He knows." She thought about that. Veck had been building this for at least 18 months, more likely longer. He was organized, patient, technically sophisticated, and connected enough to recruit an active admiral and an active signals intelligence officer. He'd had a deadline and nearly made it. And now he knew that he hadn't, and he knew that they knew. "Where is he now?" she said. "We're working on that," said one of the attorneys. She understood what that meant. Mustn't. They found Veck's car at Dulles Airport at 7:23 that evening, empty. His passport hadn't been flagged on any outbound flight, which meant either he hadn't used it or he'd used something else. The working group pushed into emergency protocols, border notifications, international alerts, the specific machinery of consequence that moved very fast once the right people turned it on, but that still required time to activate fully. Emily was not part of those calls. She'd finished her analysis, delivered her findings, and was now sitting in a corridor outside the 4th-floor conference room on a hard chair, drinking a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long and eating half of a sandwich someone had brought her without explanation. Fielding, the DIA escort, stood at the end of the corridor. Tran came through the conference room door, saw Emily, and sat down in the adjacent chair. She looked like someone who'd been running on procedure for 17 hours and was starting to feel the ground. "Veck's financial records just came through," Tran said. 3 overseas transfers in the last 36 hours. Before notification." She paused. "He knew notification was coming before we sent it." Emily looked at her. "Someone in the working group," Tran said, "or adjacent to it." She said it carefully, like a person placing something fragile on a surface. There it was. Not just 7 names, not just the immediate network. A warning had reached Veck before the official notification, which meant the network extended into the current investigation. Someone in the last 18 hours had made a call they shouldn't have. Emily thought about the 17 people at the table, the several more at the perimeter, the attorneys, the analysts, the person who'd pulled the contractor registry code and confirmed the match, and the person who'd told that person to pull it, and the chain of people through which every piece of significant information had moved in the last 18 hours. How many people knew the notification timing before it went out? She said. Tran looked at the wall. 12, confirmed. Then that's your next 12 names. Tran was quiet. The investigation of the network can't be conducted by people who might be part of the network, Emily said. You need to isolate the working group, everyone who knew the notification timing before delivery. She looked at her coffee. Not accuse them, isolate them. Verify them one by one. That's going to take time we don't have if Vec is in transit. I know. But if you don't do it, Vec isn't the only problem. Whoever warned him is still in the room. Tran stood up. She stood there for a moment like she was deciding something. Then she went back through the conference room door. Emily finished the sandwich. It was turkey. She didn't particularly like turkey, but she ate it completely because she'd been awake for most of the last 31 hours, and her body needed the input regardless of preference. Her phone buzzed. Deb. Third call today. She'd missed the first two in the flight and the briefing. She answered it. Emily. Deb's voice was the specific mix of worry and irritation that came from someone who genuinely cared about you but had run out of patience for it. It's been 15 hours since you sent me a 3-word text. I know. I'm sorry. Are you actually okay? She thought about how to answer that. I'm in Washington. A beat. Washington, D.C. Yes. For your family emergency. But Deb, I covered your patients. I explained your absence to Dr. Nguyen, which was not a fun conversation. I rescheduled your Monday cases. A pause. But I need to know when you're coming back. She looked at the corridor ceiling. I don't know yet. A few days. Emily. I'll call you tonight. I promise. Deb was quiet for a moment. You're in something, aren't you? It wasn't really a question. Deb had worked alongside her for 4 years and was sharp in the way that people who paid attention were sharp. I'll explain when I can, Emily said. Another pause. Okay, Deb said finally. Call me. She hung up. But Kane's tribunal was formally convened on the 3rd morning in a military proceeding that was closed to media, but not to the record. Emily's compiled analysis was entered as primary evidence before she arrived. When she did arrive, by car, escorted, in borrowed clothes that still weren't quite right, the hearing room was smaller than she expected. Wood paneling, a raised bench with 3 military judges, a table for the prosecution, a table for Kane's legal team, and a gallery that held 20 people. Kane was already seated when she came in. She hadn't seen him since he'd been walked out of the command level with Voss. In the command room, he'd had the full weight of his uniform and his rank and the institutional architecture of the facility around him. Here, he had a suit and 2 attorneys and a posture that was still military straight, but carrying something different underneath it now. Not confidence. The performance of confidence, which was a different thing entirely. He looked at her when she sat in the gallery. She looked back. She didn't have a particular expression prepared. She just looked. His gaze moved away first. The proceeding was methodical. The prosecution walked through the transmission archive, the origin log, the access record, the inbound analysis. They presented Webb's formal statement. He'd accepted a cooperation agreement in exchange for testimony, which meant his account was now part of the record and had the weight of a cooperating witness with documented evidence behind it. They presented the communications directory, the contractor entity, the financial transfers. Kane's attorneys argued procedural violations. They argued the evidentiary chain on the transmission decode. They submitted a formal challenge to Emily's readmission to the facility, which the prosecution responded to with the Joint Chief's authorization and Galloway's sign-off, and a documented timeline that left no gap large enough to stand in. Then they submitted something else. Emily watched Kane's lead attorney stand and heard the argument begin and understood within the first 60 seconds where it was going. The attorney was building a narrative around Emily's classified service record, specifically the gap in it, the portions that had been classified prior to the declassification order, and the period between her removal from the operational area and her readmission. He was arguing that in that window, the 19 minutes she'd spent in the corridor, She'd had opportunity and motive to access a secure terminal through the observation window's adjacent junction panel, plant the origin log timestamp, and construct a false evidentiary trail. It was a specific, technically detailed argument. It required familiarity with the facility's architecture. Emily looked at the attorney. Then she looked at the prosecution team, who were already pulling counter documentation. The argument took 11 minutes to make. The prosecution took 7 minutes to dismantle it, using the facility's physical security logs for the corridor junction panel, which showed no access in the relevant window, and the authentication records for every terminal in the operational area, which showed no irregular access, and the independent verification by Voss's agent, who had been stationed in the corridor and whose written report specifically noted that Emily had remained stationary at the observation window for the full duration of her removal. The argument failed. But it had been built on something that required knowing where the junction panel was, knowing what access to it would look like, knowing the specific gap in the physical security coverage. Insider knowledge. Emily looked at Kane across the room. He was watching his attorney. His expression was unchanged. She thought about that all afternoon. The working group isolation protocol produced a result on the second day. 12 people had known the notification timing before delivery. 11 of them were confirmed clean through independent verification, movements, communications, access logs, the unglamorous mechanics of ruling out rather than ruling in. The 12th was a senior analyst named Broder, who had been attached to Galloway's office for 7 months, and whose personal financial records, pulled under emergency authorization, showed a pattern of payments from a shell account that traced back 3 steps to a subsidiary of the contractor entity. Broder had been in the room for Emily's full inbound layer briefing. He'd been sitting at the perimeter, behind the principals, with a tablet. When investigators went to his apartment at 6:40 on the second morning, he wasn't there. The apartment was clean, not disturbed, not recently vacated, just clean in the specific way of someone who'd tidied up before leaving. Dishes done. Bed made. Nothing obviously missing, except his secondary laptop, the one that wasn't registered to his government account. Emily heard about Broder from Tran, who came to the terminal room where Emily was finishing the final documentation package and said it with the flat tone of someone delivering information they didn't enjoy. "He knew I was going to flag the isolation protocol," Emily said. "He was in the room when you told me." "When does VEC's next financial transfer window close?" Tran looked at her. "International freeze was fully active at 800 this morning. If he moved anything after 800, it'll be visible." "But before 800? "Before 800, we're still compiling." Emily looked at the documentation package on her screen. The full record, transmission archive, inbound analysis, origin logs, timeline reconstruction, evidentiary chain documentation. Clean, complete, airtight, to the extent that anything was airtight. "Broder was the attorney's source," she said. Tran looked at her. "The argument at the tribunal, about the junction panel and the corridor gap, that's not publicly available information. Kane's attorney got it from somewhere." She turned in her chair. "Broder was in the room when the facility layout was discussed. He had access to the physical security documentation." Tran was very still. "Kane's defense and VEC's escape aren't parallel problems," Emily said. "They're the same problem." The silence in the room had a specific texture. "If Broder fed the defense team their technical argument," Emily said carefully, "and Broder is connected to the contractor entity, and the contractor entity is VEC's vehicle, then Kane's defense attorneys are receiving strategy from the man they're supposed to be independent of." She paused. "The defense is being coordinated from outside." Tran's expression had gone somewhere that Emily couldn't fully read. "That's obstruction," Tran said, "on top of everything else." "Yes. We'd need to prove the communication chain." "Broder's secondary laptop," Emily said. "If it's anywhere, that's where the chain is." Tran stood up. She stood still for a moment with the expression of someone who'd walked into a building expecting one room and found a floor plan considerably more complex than advertised. Then she went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Carter," she said, "is there anything else in that archive that we haven't pulled yet?" Emily looked at the screen, at the documentation package, at the 14 months of data she'd worked through in the last 40 hours. "I found a sequencing anomaly this morning," she said, "in the inbound archive. I flagged it for secondary review." "What kind of anomaly?" Emily turned back to the screen and pulled it up. The anomaly was small, a timing gap in the inbound instruction sequence, a period of 11 days, 4 months ago, where the inbound traffic stopped completely and then resumed. Not a technical failure. The surrounding traffic was clean. The gap was deliberate. She'd assumed it was a planned operational pause. Standard tradecraft. Go quiet periodically to reduce detection risk. But when she'd looked at it this morning against the outbound timeline, the gap didn't correspond to any reduction in outbound activity. Kane had kept pushing data out during those 11 days. He'd been operating without inbound instructions, which meant someone had been directing him directly without the channel during that window, which meant there was a communication method they hadn't found yet. "The gap is 11 days, Emily said. Kane was still active. Whoever was directing him during that period used a different channel." She looked at Tran. "One we haven't decoded." Tran was very still in the doorway. "There's a second channel?" Emily said. "The second channel took 31 hours to find. Not because it was hidden better than the first, because it wasn't digital at all." Emily figured it out on the third morning, when she was going back through Kane's duty logs for the 11-day gap and noticed something that wasn't in the signals data, wasn't in the access records, wasn't in anything she'd been looking at. It was in the facility's visitor log, a physical document kept at the front security desk, the kind of record that predated the digital systems and ran parallel to them out of institutional habit and regulatory requirement. During the 11-day gap, Kane had received 3 in-person visitors, all listed under a consulting firm called Archer Strategic Group, with a registered address in Northern Virginia. The visits were logged as standard contractor consultations, not unusual for a facility that hosted multiple ongoing defense contracts. The visitor names were different each time. The firm's authorization credentials were current and properly signed. The firm didn't exist. The address was a mailbox at a commercial receiving service. The authorization credentials had been processed through the same contractor registry pathway as VEC's primary entity. 3 visits. 3 sets of instructions delivered in person, face-to-face, with no digital trace. Old school. Patient. Almost insulting in how simple it was compared to everything else. She brought it to Tran at 7:40 in the morning. Tran looked at the visitor log printouts for about 90 seconds, then made a call. 20 minutes later, the visitor descriptions from the front security desk staff were being formally recorded. All 3 visitors had used the same physical characteristic set, same height range, same approximate age, nondescript clothing, face masks logged as standard health protocol, which were still common enough not to attract comment. No usable physical description, but the authorization credential pathway traced back to VEC's network, and Broder's secondary laptop, found in a storage locker at Union Station, located via a key found in Broder's desk drawer that nobody had thought to check immediately, contained the communication chain between Broder and the Archer Strategic Group email domain. Broder had been coordinating the visits, scheduling them, confirming them with a contact whose email handle resolved to a server registered in a jurisdiction that had no extradition agreement with the United States, but whose writing pattern and operational terminology matched VEC's documented communication style closely enough that the forensic linguistics team gave it a 73% confidence rating. 73% wasn't a conviction, but it was enough, combined with everything else, to close the picture. By 4 p.m. on the third day, the case against Kane, Webb, Paris, Broder, and the 7 names from the communications directory was structurally complete. 4 of the 7 had retained counsel and indicated cooperation. 2 were contesting. 1 had attempted to leave the country via a private airfield in Georgia and was currently in federal custody. Roland Vec had not been found. Emily was in the documentation room when Morse came to find her. She'd been reviewing the final evidentiary package, not because anyone had asked her to, just because she wanted to be sure every piece of her work was clean before she was no longer the one holding it. Old habit from the field. You didn't hand off a patient without checking every line yourself first. Morse sat down across from her without ceremony. He looked like he'd slept about as much as she had, which wasn't much. Webb's cooperation agreement is finalized, he said. His testimony is sufficient. with the transmission archive to proceed to tribunal for Kane without additional primary evidence. Good. The 7 directory contacts are being processed separately through federal channels. 4 of the cooperating 4 have provided additional network intelligence that's already been forwarded to a separate investigative team. He paused. The scope is larger than what came out of your initial analysis. How much larger? Larger. He said it with the specific tone of someone who couldn't or wouldn't be more specific in the current setting. She understood. There were parts of this she was not going to be told because they were parts that were still active and operational, and telling a civilian nurse, even a civilian nurse who just spent 3 days decoding the architecture of a multi-year intelligence penetration, would constitute an unnecessary exposure. She was okay with that. She knew her piece of it. Her piece was done. Vec, she said. Morse looked at the table. Still in transit. International coordination is active. He moved through 2 countries in the first 24 hours. After that, the trail goes quiet. He paused. He planned the exit well, better than the rest of the operation, actually. He planned everything well, she said. He just didn't plan for someone who'd used his own encoding system. Morse looked at her. Something in his face, not a smile exactly, but the shape of one, the place where one would be if he let it. No, he said. He didn't plan for that. They sat for a moment. There's something you should know, Morse said. The tribunal preliminary hearing. Kane's defense team formally withdrew the junction panel argument this morning. She looked at him. The presiding judge had already flagged it for review given the source questions. Kane's lead attorney withdrew it before the review was completed. Morse paused. Ethical liability. They knew where the information came from. From Broder. Yes. Once Broder's connection to the contractor entity was confirmed and entered into the record, any argument built on information he'd supplied became a liability for the attorneys who used it. He paused. Kane's team is now attempting to negotiate his cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Does he have anything they want? He knows Vec's operational methodology. He knows the in-person contact protocol in more detail than Webb does. Morse was quiet for a moment. He might help find Vec. She thought about that. Thought about Kane walking out of the command room with Voss, head up, chin set, the performance of a man who was choosing to cooperate rather than being required to. Thought about him looking at her across the tribunal room and looking away. Let him negotiate, she said. If it finds Vec, let him negotiate. Morse nodded. He'd probably already thought the same thing. He was asking her because he thought she deserved to have a voice in it, and she appreciated that even though her voice didn't carry legal weight in the proceeding. There's something else, he said. She waited. He reached into the folder he'd carried in and set a document on the table in front of her. Not a personnel file. A formal letter, on official letterhead, with a seal at the top she recognized from her time in uniform. She read it. It was a commendation. Formal, signed, specific. It listed the transmission identification, the inbound layer analysis, the southern relay intervention, the timeline reconstruction, the documentation of the secondary channel. It named her by her full name and her former rank, which was listed correctly for the first time in any official document she'd seen in 6 years. Sergeant First Class Emily A. Carter. Medical Intelligence Unit, 3rd Special Operations Command. Classified Service 2014 to 2020. Her actual record. On paper. With her name on it. She held the document and read it twice. Then she set it down. This is public, she said. It will be. The commendation is being formally entered into the public military record. The classified portions of your service are being noted as classified but acknowledged as existing. He paused. People won't know what you did overseas, but they'll know you did something. She looked at the document. She thought about the night she'd left the Army. Not discharged, not removed, just the end of a contract that she hadn't renewed, walking out of a building very much like the one she'd spent the last 3 days in, with a box that held her personal items and a service record that would be sealed on Monday morning. She'd driven to Delverton because it was a city she'd never been to, and she'd needed a place that held no expectations. She'd taken the job at Hargrove because hospitals needed people who could work under pressure, and she was one of them, and that was enough of a reason. She'd spent 6 years building a life that was real, that was hers, that didn't ask her to be anything she wasn't. And she'd been okay with that. She'd chosen it. But there was something in holding this document that she hadn't expected. Not pride exactly. More like the specific relief of something being seen, something that had existed, that had mattered, that had cost something, finally being acknowledged to exist. She folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. Morse nodded once. The public account broke on the 4th day. Not the classified details, not the transmission architecture, or the inbound analysis, or the specific methodology, but the broad shape of it, a coordinated infrastructure attack on the national defense grid, averted by a combined civilian-military response. An active investigation into a multi-year intelligence penetration operation. A senior military officer under tribunal, multiple federal arrests, an ongoing international fugitive search. The press got what they were given, which wasn't much, but the piece they were given included a detail that DICE had specifically authorized for release, that the initial identification of the attack vector had been made by a civilian technical consultant with a military medical intelligence background. It didn't name her. She'd asked that it not name her, and they'd respected it. But Delverton was a city of 400,000 people, and Hargrove Memorial was not a large hospital, and the detail about the medical background landed in a specific way with the people who knew her, which she found out when her phone lit up the afternoon the story broke. Deb called first. Emily, is this about you?" "Partly." A sound that was somewhere between shock and something else, something bigger. "You've been here for 4 years, and I didn't know any of this." "Most of it wasn't mine to say." "Are you okay?" "Yes." A pause. "When are you coming home?" She looked out the window of the building she'd been in for 4 days. Washington in November. Gray sky, bare trees on the far edge of the parking lot, a flag moving in wind she couldn't feel from in here. "Tomorrow," she said. "I think tomorrow." Ruiz texted. 3 words. "That was you." She sent back 2. "Get sleep." He responded with a thumbs up, and she suspected he was still at a terminal somewhere. Park sent a formal professional email that was very precise and said, in its last sentence, that it had been the most technically interesting 48 hours of his career. She respected him enough to take the compliment seriously. Kane's tribunal concluded 8 days after the night in the bunker. Emily was not present for the verdict. She was back at Hargrove Memorial in the middle of a 12-hour shift when Morse texted her the summary. Guilty on all primary charges: dereliction of duty, unauthorized communication of classified material, conduct unbecoming, conspiracy to commit infrastructure sabotage, stripped of rank and pension, referred to federal prosecution for the civilian criminal charges. She was between patients when she read it, standing at the nurse's station with the text on her phone screen and the sounds of the ER around her. Someone down the hall asking about discharge paperwork, a monitor alarming 3 rooms over, the squeak of a cartwheel on the linoleum floor. She put the phone back in her pocket. Deb appeared beside her, reading something in a chart. She glanced at Emily without looking up. "You okay?" "Yeah." "You have that face." "What face?" "The one you get when something is over and you're not sure what to do with that yet." Emily looked at her. Deb was still looking at the chart. 4 years of working alongside each other, and Deb had always been better at reading her than most people were. "Something is over," Emily said. Deb closed the chart. "Go get your next patient. There's a kid in Bay 4 with a laceration that needs cleaning, and he's been waiting 20 minutes, and he's 8 years old and scared." Emily went. Titan. 3 weeks later, she drove to a federal building in downtown Delverton for a formal deposition that was the last of 4 she'd given as part of the ongoing federal proceedings. The 4 cooperating contacts from the communications directory had pleaded. The 2 contesting ones had their pre-trial hearings scheduled for the following spring. Webb had testified, and his cooperation agreement was holding. Roland Veck was found on the 19th day at a private residence in a country that, under significant diplomatic pressure, agreed to detain him pending a formal extradition request. The extradition would take time. International legal processes always did. But he was contained, which was the operative thing, and the network that had required an active architect was now architect-less. She gave the deposition in a windowless room with a federal attorney and a stenographer and a transcript that would become part of a record she'd never fully see. She answered every question completely and added nothing that wasn't asked. When it was done, the federal attorney, a man named Ose, who had the tired, careful manner of someone managing 17 cases simultaneously, looked at his notes and then at her. "I have to tell you," he said, "I've done a lot of depositions. People in high-stakes situations, military, intelligence, corporate." He paused. "The quality of documentation you produced under the conditions you were working in it's not something most trained analysts could have produced." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he said. "I just think it's worth saying." "Thank you," she said. She meant it. She took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into December air that was cold enough to see her breath. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The street was ordinary, people walking, a bus at the corner, a coffee shop across the road with a line out the door. She'd been here 4 years. This city, these streets, this ordinary and chosen life. None of what had happened had changed it. The ER was still the ER. Her apartment was still her apartment. Deb was still Deb. But something had been returned to her that she hadn't known she'd been missing. Not rank, not recognition. She didn't need her name in a story for it to be true. Something quieter than that. Something more like the specific wholeness of a person who has been fully seen, even briefly, even by a small number of people in a room in Washington, and doesn't have to carry the weight of invisibility anymore. She walked to her car. 6 weeks after the night in the bunker, General Morse called. She was at home, a Tuesday evening, eating soup she'd made from a recipe she'd been meaning to try for 3 months. It was okay, a little undersalted. "I have something to run by you," Morse said, "and I want to be clear up front that the answer can be no." "Go ahead." "There's a position," he said. "A new program. Civilian-military hybrid, joint command under the Deputy SecDef's office. The function is signals intelligence consulting for infrastructure security. Specifically, legacy system vulnerabilities in defense-adjacent networks." A pause. The program was created partly in response to what happened. The gap that was exploited was a legacy system gap. She stirred the soup. "The position is consulting level," he continued, "not active duty. You'd keep your civilian status. You could maintain your clinical work at whatever fraction you chose. The program doesn't require relocation." Another pause. "They want someone who understands both the medical encoding side and the operational deployment context. They want someone who knows where the gaps are because they've used the system from inside." Yes. She thought about it. She thought about the 8-year-old in Bay 4 with the laceration who'd been scared and had stopped being scared within about 90 seconds of her coming in. Not because of anything dramatic she'd done, but because she'd talked to him like a person and cleaned the wound thoroughly and said it was going to hurt, and it did hurt, and she told him when it was done. She thought about the cardiac patient she'd handed off the night of the pager, and whether the handoff had been adequate, and that she'd never be fully satisfied with that decision. She thought about Ruiz still at a terminal somewhere, probably finding a pattern that nobody else was looking for. She thought about the 11-day gap and the visitor log, and a physical record on paper that nobody had thought to check. She thought about the fact that the gap had been exploited because nobody had thought to look at the legacy system. Nobody had thought it mattered enough to protect. "Part-time," she said. "Consulting basis. ER schedule stays primary." Morse was quiet for a second. "I'll put that in the request. I'm serious about the ER schedule. I know you are." "Because the work I do there is not less important," she said. "I need that to be clearly understood by everyone in the program." "Carter," Morse said, "you spent the last month being the clearest proof of that argument that anyone could have made. I don't think you'll need to fight that particular fight." She thought about that. "All right," she said. "Send me the paperwork, Mom." The commendation ceremony was not what she expected, which was probably for the best because she'd expected something large and formal, and what it actually was a room of about 30 people in a building she'd been in before, on a Thursday afternoon, with bad coffee and a presentation setup that somebody had clearly assembled in a hurry. Dice was there. Voss was there. Galloway. A handful of people she'd worked alongside during the 3 days and a handful she didn't recognize. Ruiz was in the back row, still looking like he needed more sleep. He gave her a small nod when she came in. Morse presented the formal commendation. He read it aloud, and it was specific and factual, and named what had actually happened without decoration. She stood and listened and didn't try to arrange her face into any particular expression. When it was done, Dice said a few words about institutional vulnerability and institutional response and the value of unconventional expertise in conventional settings. He said it well. She believed he meant it. Then people came up with coffee cups and quiet congratulations, and the specific warmth of a room full of people who had been through something difficult together and were glad to be standing on the other side of it. Voss found her near the coffee table. Voss was not a warm person in the conventional sense. She was precise and direct and didn't perform things she didn't feel. But she stood next to Emily for a moment and said, "The defense tried 2 more procedural challenges yesterday. Both denied. I heard. Kane's federal arraignment is in January." "I know." Voss looked at the room. "The program Morse briefed you on," she said. "The hybrid consulting position." Emily looked at her. "I'm involved in the oversight structure," Voss said. "I pushed for it." A pause. "I pushed for the specific person to fill it." Emily hadn't known that. "You should know I pushed for it," Voss said, "because I think you should know what the job actually is before you accept it. It's not going to be ceremonial. It's not a thank you title." She met Emily's gaze. "The gaps in legacy defense systems are real, and they're not all identified, and the people currently tasked with identifying them are not the right people for the job." "Why not?" "Because they know the systems theoretically. They haven't used them under the conditions they were designed for." Voss paused. "You have." Emily was quiet for a moment. "You could train people." "We are. But training takes time, and the gaps exist now. And someone with your specific background and the analytical work you demonstrated this month is not a resource that should be sitting in an ER in Delverton and only surfacing when there's a crisis." "I disagree," Emily said. Voss looked at her steadily. "Someone with my specific background sitting in an ER in Delverton is exactly the right place for someone with my specific background," Emily said, "because the ER is where the work is real. It's where you find out what you can actually do under pressure, not in a simulation, not in a training environment. Real patients, real calls, real consequences." She paused. "If I lose that, I lose something that keeps me calibrated. I need that." Voss considered that for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly. "Part-time," she said. "Part-time." "That works," Voss said. And then, after a pause that felt like it cost her something, "I underestimated you when you first came into the command level. I want to say that." "You didn't know me." "No, but I should have read the room better." Voss looked at her coffee cup. "Kane wanted you gone in 3 minutes. That alone should have told me something." Emily almost smiled. "It did tell you something. You called Hawkins." Eventually, 14 minutes later, Voss's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile either, but was adjacent to one. "I'll do better." "So will I," Emily said. "I should have pushed harder the first time instead of walking out." "You were right to walk out. The readmission chain would have been messier if you'd created a confrontation." "Maybe." Emily thought about it. "Or maybe 14 minutes is a long time when a relay node is going dark." Voss looked at her. "Both things are true." "Both things usually are." They stood with their bad coffee for a moment. 2 people who had met in a crisis and understood each other now in the particular way that crises created. Not friendship, not exactly, but something durable, a specific mutual recognition. Ruiz appeared at Emily's elbow. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands like he needed the warmth. "I got reassigned," he said, "to the new program." She looked at him. "Morse told you?" "Galloway. Apparently I'm being described as having exceptional instinct for pattern identification in legacy signal environments." He looked slightly bewildered by this. "I found a thermal anomaly in a sensor grid." "You found it in 90 seconds, she said. "You told me where to look." "You knew what to do with the look." She meant it. The program needs that. He nodded slowly. He still looked uncertain, the way young people looked when they were standing at the beginning of something larger than they'd planned for. She remembered that feeling. You never got used to it. You just got better at moving forward while it was still present. Will I work with you? He said. Sometimes, she said, when the ER schedule allows. He nodded again, seemed to find that acceptable. He drifted back toward the coffee table, and she watched him go and thought about what he'd been 6 weeks ago, 25 years old, sitting at a signal station at 3 a.m. with no particular reason to help the nurse who'd been walked out of the room and every reason to stay in his lane. He hadn't stayed in his lane. He'd asked what she needed. That was the whole thing, really. That was the piece that got lost in the formal record, in the commendations and the tribunals and the proceedings. All the people who'd asked what was needed and done it anyway, despite the pressure of the room and the weight of authority pointing in another direction. Ruiz at his terminal, Pressfield calling Morse when Emily was in the corridor. Tran in the fourth-floor conference room, standing up with information that made her job harder. And Emily herself on a hard chair in a corridor at 2:50 in the morning, with a classified pager in her scrub pocket and the Eastern relay going dark on the other side of an observation window, deciding that walking out was not the same as being done. She'd learned that a long time ago, and in harder circumstances. Institutions did not save you. The people inside them sometimes did, if they were paying attention and willing to act on what they saw. And sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, you were the person they needed to be paying attention to. She was back at Hargrove Memorial the following Monday morning, 6:45 a.m., in the locker room putting on her scrubs. Her name was on the duty board. Her patients were waiting. The ER was already moving. She could hear it from back here, that specific rhythm of a department in early shift momentum, calls and carts, and the hum of a place doing the thing it existed to do. She tied her shoes, stood up, checked her pockets, stethoscope, pager, phone. The pager was the facility's pager now. The secondary one was at home in a drawer, which was where it lived between the moments it was needed. She walked out of the locker room and into the department. Deb was at the nurse's station, head down and something on a screen, coffee at her right elbow. She looked up when Emily came in. Bay 2 is a possible sepsis presentation. 67-year-old came in from a long-term care facility, Deb said. Bay 5 is a kid, 12, head injury from a bicycle fall. Parents are anxious. Bay 7 is yours from last Thursday, back with chest pain. I'll take Bay 2 first, Emily said. She was already moving. She passed Bay 5 on the way, glanced through the curtain at the kid, 12, head injury, scared in the specific way kids were scared when they were trying not to look scared in front of their parents, and made a mental note of his posture and his color. She'd be back in 8 minutes. She pushed through into Bay 2. The 67-year-old was named Margaret. She had the gray-faced, quieted look of someone who'd been sick long enough to stop expecting it to get better. Her blood pressure was wrong. Her breathing was wrong. She needed a lot of things in a specific order, and she needed them now. Emily pulled on gloves. Margaret, she said, my name is Emily. I'm your nurse. I need you to tell me when this started, and I need you to be as exact as you can. Margaret looked at her with eyes that were present and tired. Yesterday morning, she said. Maybe before that. That's good. That helps. Emily was already moving, already building the clinical picture, already thinking 3 steps ahead. I'm going to take care of you. She meant it. She always meant it. This was the thing that the commendation didn't capture and the formal record couldn't hold. Not the signals analysis or the transmission decode or the 3 days in Washington. Those had been necessary, and she was glad she'd done them, and she'd do them again without hesitation. But this Bay, this patient, this 67-year-old woman who had come in from a care facility and was sick and scared and needed someone to be exactly and completely present with her. This was the work that had kept Emily Carter honest for 6 years. The work that required nothing of her except what she actually was. The work that reminded her, every shift, that competence wasn't a credential. It was a practice. It was something you either did or you didn't, in the room where it mattered, with the person in front of you. Nobody in that bay knew what had happened 3 weeks ago. Margaret didn't know. The aide at the door didn't know. The attending who'd be in to review in 20 minutes didn't know. Emily Carter was the nurse in Bay 2 doing the job, and that was the whole story. The rest of it was just how she'd gotten here.